Chapter 31. Eccentric Parent. Immediately, after hearing her words, Luo Yanyan slouched over the sofa. The smile on her face had disappeared, and heaviness shadowed over her features. The glint in her eyes had faded almost completely, and she murmured, "Well, you've already seen the bulk of it. I went on a blind date last night, and my parents came with me. Afterward, I rented a room for them at a hotel, and I slept there with them." Jianyan placed her half-eaten bowl back onto the table and fell silent. At the sight of her friend's solemn expression, she cautiously questioned, "Yanyan, did your parents—" She paused, hesitating. "Did your parents force you to do this?" Luo Yanyan didn't say the word, but her unshed tears were all the answer she needed. Jianyan resisted the urge to sigh as she pushed the bowl away from her and reached over to hold her friend's hand. It seemed that she had already lost her appetite. "Well, what do you think of him?" She changed her question. "I don't like him." Luo Yanyan whispered bitterly, shaking her head. "But my parents like him. He has a stable business and a good family, and for them, it's far better than what Shen Yunfeng had to offer." "Then, do you plan to break up with Shen Yunfeng?" Shen Yunfeng was Luo Yanyan's boyfriend back at Tsinghua University. They were the ultimate dream couple. In fact, she remembered all those times when she'd third wheel with them, back when they were still second years. That was until Mrs. Luo had found out about their relationship. Shen Yunfeng may have been a nice guy, but he wasn't well off. In fact, both of his parents were farmers, which was met with a harsh rejection from her parents. Despite this, they were still together. Shen Yunfeng had graduated from university and worked in Tsinghua City. But the year after that, he returned home to take the civil service exam. Although they were still in contact, Jianyan suspected that their relationship must have grown strained over the years. "I don't know." Luo Yanyan leaned against the table as if the mere topic had drained her almost completely. Tears streamed down her face, and her eyes shone so much helplessness that even Zhan Yun couldn't help but wince. "Yun, I don't know what to do anymore. My parents, they didn't even bother asking if I liked him, you know? One minute we were on a blind date, and the next minute, they're pushing for an engagement. I tried to argue with them last night, but I don't think they even cared." "Are they out of their minds?" Jianyan spluttered out, eyes widening in surprise. "Marriage is it's just too much. They can't make these types of decisions right off the bat. I hate it. I hate how they don't understand me, that I don't have much of a choice with this. What if I just die and become an ATM? Maybe I'd be more of use to them." The more she spoke, the more devastated she felt. Tears fell onto the cotton sheets as Luo Yanyan continually sniffled. "But you know what? I'm not even surprised. They've been waiting for the day where they could finally get rid of me. All they ever wanted was the betrothal gift so that they could have enough money to pay for my brother's own engagement." "Yanyan, you can't do this." Jianyan pulled out a few tissues and handed them to her. If she didn't know Luo Yanyan very well, she would have thought that her friend was simply exaggerating. But after hearing the way Mr. and Mrs. Luo had yelled at her and controlled her all these years, she knew exactly what they were capable of. "I've already made it clear to them that if they ever forced me to marry that man, I'd break off all relations with them." Luo Yanyan curled her fingers into fists, clutching the tissues close to her chest. Her chest heaved up and down as dark green veins bulged out from her skin. "Yanyan." Jianyan looked as if she wanted to say something but changed her mind in a swift second. Swallowing her words, she turned over and sighed. The drive from Tsinghua City to Boshan City took around 2.5 hours, but if they took a train, they could arrive there within 45 minutes. Jianyan had decided to go back to Boshan to visit her mother today, so she had booked a ticket a few days in advance. Even then, her friend's words lingered in her mind. As she sat inside the compartment, she couldn't help but gaze out the window. Even if Luo Yanyan was adamant with her decision, she still couldn't help but feel uneasy. She knew her friend all too well. Luo Yanyan was kind and sweet, but she was sometimes too soft-hearted. If her mother had actually threatened to break ties with her, her friend might later be forced to submit. After all, Luo Yanyan had always been one to give way to her parents, even if it meant hurting herself in the process. When Zhan Yun had arrived at her mother's household, it was already noon. She had already called ahead of time, so her mother and Auntie Chin had already expected her arrival. 6 years ago, when her father's affair was exposed, they had moved out of their old home and settled in a rented house not far from the cityscape. Just when Zhan Yun had thought the worst had passed, her mother fell down the stairs. She broke her spine and had to stay in the hospital for more than a year. All their savings were spent on keeping her mother alive, yet she couldn't be healed, at least, not totally. At that time she was still studying at the university. When the news had reached her dorm, it was as if her entire identity had been struck down by a bolt of lightning. For so long she had lived her own fairy tale, and in a click of a finger, she was already living her worst nightmare. Her family's burdens rested upon her shoulders, and she was forced to grow up. As she was studying in the day, she had to take on a part-time job at night just to cover both of their expenses. Yet, no matter how hard Jianyan worked, she only had enough money to pay for all their necessities, her education and her mother's treatment. Not having the money to pay their rent, they had to move to an even older and smaller house in Qinghu. The place was even farther into the suburbs, but there was a recovery hospital nearby. Her mother had lived there for 6 years. Mom, Auntie, it's time to eat. Jian Yun immediately went into the kitchen to cook some of her mother's all-time favorite dishes. Once she was all finished, she walked over to Auntie Chin and helped carry Mrs. Jian to the wheelchair before pushing her towards the dining table. Yun's cooking skills are excellent. The man who'd marry you someday would be extremely lucky. Auntie Chin winked. Although this wasn't the first time she had tasted her niece's cooking, she still couldn't help but be impressed every time she took a bite. Yun is so beautiful, but you're still not married. Mrs. John sighed. She was ecstatic to see her daughter visit after a few weeks, but whenever she thought about her pretty daughter still being single after all these years, she couldn't help but feel anxious. After all, Yun was already 26 years old. A few more years and she would already be past her prime. Mom, she protested. Marrying someone isn't as easy as picking cabbages, you know. You have to wait for the right person. I've been hearing those words ever since you graduated. Tell me, when's the right person going to appear? Jian Yun knew that her mother had developed a bad temper after her injury. If this topic continued, her mother would definitely grow irritated. Therefore, she bent her neck over and buried her head into her food, not daring to say another word. After all, she didn't come all this way just to get into an argument with her. All right, little Fei, it's time to eat. She just returned here, and you're already forcing her, Auntie Chin teased, trying her best to smooth things over, and it worked. In the next second, the scowl in her mother's face had dissolved, and they resumed talking about the events that had transpired during each other's absence. After the meal, Jian Yun quickly helped Auntie Chin clean up the dishes. While she was doing so, she secretly handed the older woman 2,000 yuan. Yun, what are you doing? She pushed it back, refusing to take it. You already gave me this month's salary. I heard that Uncle Li isn't in good health recently. You couldn't go back and take care of him, so at least let this help you. Although it isn't much, it could get some supplements for him, Jian Yun insisted. Auntie Chin's family wasn't as well off, and her son wasn't that much of a help either, given that he didn't bother to help out with all their expenses, so it was the least she could do. After all, if it weren't for her, Jian Yun wouldn't know what to do. There's really no need. Your mother has to undergo another surgery, and she'll have far greater expenses in the future. I appreciate it truly, but you need it more than me, child. Auntie Chin shook her head. Auntie, I'm fine. Besides, my salary is quite high right now, so you really don't have to worry about me. Take the money, please, or else I'll feel bad. Seeing how concerned Auntie Chin was for her, Jian Yun felt a little soft-hearted. The tip of her nose was tinged red, and she had to turn away for a second to stop herself from shedding a tear. Ever since her mother became sick, they were ostracized from society. So many people had said various words against her mother, slandering her behind her back. Auntie Chin was the only one who stood by them, encouraging her to reach for higher heights. It would all be over, she once said. Fine, Yun, but I won't allow it next time. Auntie Chin smiled, stroking her face. Jian Yun chuckled. However, before she could say anything else, her mother had called out, Jian Yun, come out for a moment. Go. Auntie Chin said before whispering in her ear, your mother hasn't been in a good mood these past few days, so you shouldn't anger her too much, okay? I know. With an understanding nod, Jian Yun left the kitchen. The front porch was old-fashioned with its hardwood boards and fading paint. Even then, Mrs. Default Jian didn't look too bothered by it all as she sat on a creaky rocking chair, basking in the afternoon sun. When she saw Jian Yun stepping out of the doorway, she motioned to the stool in front of her. Sit down. Chapter 32, Address I'll pick you up. Mom, what's wrong? Seeing her mother's furrowed eyebrows and pursed lips, Jian Yun couldn't help but feel a little apprehensive. There was a short pause before the older woman finally spoke. Yun, what do you think of Mr. Zhao? Ah, so that's what she wanted to talk about. Breathing a sigh of relief, Jian Yun took a moment to think about it. He's not that bad, she admitted, remembering their night together. It wasn't as awful as she had expected, given her bad luck with these types of dates. He's quite a gentleman, and he's kind of funny too. Do you think you can get along? Mrs. Jian asked again, this time tentatively. I don't want to make any assumptions about him, but I am willing to go on another date. Zhou Xiaolong was a really decent man. From their date alone, she could tell that they had gotten along well, and she'd happily agree to go on another. If her mother would force the idea of marriage on her, she was willing to consider him. Her mother nodded in satisfaction. You're right. Back then, I was so anxious and worried that you wouldn't be able to get married, and now, Ma, you're worrying too much. Look at me. Your daughter's so pretty. How can she not get married? Jian Yun leaned against her mother's knees, cooing at her like a little kitten. Her bright eyes were glittering with hidden laughter as she tried to ease her worries. I was so afraid that I'll drag you down. Her voice had gradually softened, and Mrs. Jian turned away. Even though she had been paralyzed for so many years and had aged dramatically over time, her features were still soft and sweet. Anyone who saw her would assume that she had been a beauty back in the day, and they'd be right. Ma, Don't say that. Frowning, she raised her head. At the sight of her mother's distraught face, she huffed. Besides, marriage isn't that important. I can take care of you all by myself. But my health? At this rate, I'm afraid that you'll tire yourself out. There were just some things that a mother didn't want to experience, and one of them included seeing their own child suffering from their burdens. As much as Mrs. Jian wanted to listen to her daughter's comforts, she still couldn't help but feel a little guilty. After all, if it wasn't for her, Jian Yun would have already reached newer and better heights. But I'm not tired. Her nose began to ache, but she couldn't bring herself to cry not here. Jin Yun forced a smile into her lips and gazed up at her mother's clouded eyes. See? I'm happy. As long as you're getting better, I'll be even happier, okay? When Auntie Chin stared at the pair from the living room, she couldn't help but sigh. There were just some things she couldn't intervene in, but that didn't mean that she didn't feel sorry for them. A pang of pity stroked her heart. Both of them suffered so much over the years, and it seemed that their tribulation was still not over. Dad came to see me last week. She hesitated for a moment before suggesting, how about? However, Mrs. Jian didn't even bother to listen to her daughter to know what this is about. Her previously calm mood had shifted into freezing cold anger. Her eyes flashed, and she clenched her fists so hard that her veiny hands had paled even further. Why is he looking for you, huh? Is this about the divorce agreement? Does he want me to sign it? She snorted, pushing Jian Yun away. Well, Jian Dongyun could roll himself into his grave because I'm not signing anything for him. Ma, just calm down. Will you please listen to me? Jian Yun almost fell back. As the palm of her hand scraped across the hardwood to support herself, she winced but quickly came back up to comfort her mother. He didn't mention any of this. All he wanted was to give us some money for the surgery. Then I forbid you to take his money. The more Mrs. Jian talked, the more agitated she became. Her eyes became bloodshot as she swung her arms up in the air. It was as if the mention of her father's name had brought out the raging beast from her mother's heart. The bastard! Does he think he could pay his way out of this? Have you seen what he's done? For 20 years he had lied and cheated. I was like a fool, watching him bring that bitch and her daughter into our own house. I remembered pitying them, feeding them my cooking, and this is what I get in return. I'd rather die than let you take his money. The last sentence had struck a chord with Jian Yun, and her eyes narrowed in defiance. If you hate him so much, why would you just sign the divorce papers? Aren't you only making this situation more miserable than it already is? Her voice had reached another octave, as she clenched her fists. She hated Lin Lanlan with a passion, but if there was someone else she had despised more than anyone else in the world, it was her father. Her heart burnt with so much resentment for the old man, but she couldn't understand why her mother would allow herself to wallow in such pain, yet still refuse to formally separate from him. Wasn't it better for her mother to finally free herself from the man she had hated so much? As soon as Jian Yun finished her sentence, her head swung to the side. Her hand quickly clutched her face as her eyes became glassy. The sound of her mother's slap echoed across the household, and she couldn't help but bow in shame. Jian Yun, what the hell did your father ever give you for you to defend him like this? Mrs. Jian roared, pointing at her. You want me to divorce him, and let him and that bitch Lin Rong get together? Don't you dare think about it. Goodness, if you have something to say, then it's better to talk things out. Seeing Jian Yun get slapped, Auntie Chin rushed out into the porch and stood in between the mother and daughter pair. She placed her hands on her hips and quickly lectured the older woman. You don't have to hit her. Ha, I bet you regret following a paralytic like me. What? Do you think your mother's so useless now that she's like this? Huh? Then you can go back to your father's place right now if that's what you want. Her nostrils were flaring as she violently waved her fists up in the air. Scram. Ma, please, it's all my fault. I won't ever mention him ever again. Jian Yun immediately rushed to her mother's side. Although the right side of her face was swollen from the harsh impact, she didn't feel the pain. Instead, all she felt was the harsh anxiety that crept up to her chest, eating away the tendrils of her heart. I'm not leaving you, okay? I'll never leave. See? She won't leave you. Just take your medicine. Auntie Chin took out a medicine bottle from her pocket and placed a pill into Mrs. Jian's mouth. Jian Yun used this moment to rush back into the house to grab a glass of water. Soon enough, Mrs. Jian's movements had slowed down and her anger had receded. However, as she finally calmed, the older woman kept her eyes closed, refusing to see her daughter. Yun, why don't you go and get some rest? Auntie Chin urged. You still have to take a bus back in the afternoon. I'll take care of her from here. Knowing that her mother needed to calm down a bit, Jian Yun nodded and entered the house. It was only then she felt a sharp, burning pain scorching the right side of her face. She glanced at the mirror, only to see that her previously pale face was bright red, and there were clear hand marks on the side of her cheek. As Jian Yun looked for some ointment to apply on her face, she could feel her entire body growing numb. Sighing in frustration, she sat back onto the couch and buried her face into her hands. Just when she thought she could escape from her problems, they all came knocking at her doorsteps to bite her right back in the head. She reached for her phone in her pockets, itching to call Wu Wenjing. Maybe she'd know what to do. However, as she glanced at her screen, she found a new text message. It was from Zhou Xiaolong, asking if she was free to see a movie tonight. Jianyun originally wanted to refuse, but the image of her mother's pained face flashed back into her mind. Biting her lips, she quickly replied, "All right, I'm in Boshan now, but I'll be heading back this afternoon." Since her mother wanted to marry her off so much, then he was ultimately the better choice. On the bright side, they had gotten along well enough that night, and she didn't hate him. Zhou Xiaolong sent another message. "Then we can talk about it once you get back." Got it. Jianyun was about to send it over when her phone rang. Before she could see who the caller was, she had already accepted the call. It was only when the call was connected did she finally realize who it was. Huo Liancheng. She cursed under her breath, squeezing her eyes shut. It was impossible to hang up now. At this point, all she had to do was to bear with it. "Hello? Where are you?" She wasn't all too surprised by the bluntness of his voice. He had always been very straight to the point. "I'm at Boshan City. What can I do for you, President Huo?" Jianyun phrased her words carefully. Although she didn't know why the man had called, she couldn't help but have a bad feeling about this. "There's a party tonight. You're coming with me." Jianyun blinked for a moment before glancing at the caller ID. Had she assumed that it was the wrong person? Her eyes narrowed at the name embedded in her screen. It really was Huo Liancheng. This time, she became even more confused by the invitation. "President Huo," she managed to say. "I think you called the wrong number. This is Jianyun." There was no sound from the other end of the line. Just when she thought that she had guessed correctly and was about to excuse herself, he snapped, "I know who you are." But then, "I don't understand." Even she found herself at a loss for words. If President Huo was attending a party, why would he want her to come with him? "What's your address? I'll pick you up." He didn't even bother to explain. "There's really no need. I've already booked a train," Jianyun hurriedly refused. "What's your address?" he asked again. This time he seemed even more impatient. "I'm also in Boshan." What a coincidence. Even Jianyun couldn't help but raise her eyebrows in suspicion, only to stop when the right side of her face started to hurt. Gritting her teeth, she bravely said, "Well, I already made plans for tonight." There was complete dead silence from the other end of the line. Huo Liancheng didn't hang up, so she also didn't dare. Previously, she had planned on resigning, so she didn't have to watch herself when offending Xia Bingbing. However, after visiting her mother today, she found that the situation wasn't in her favor. With Mrs. John unwilling to accept her father's help, she needed to prepare herself for more expenses that they might incur in the future. Although working at Ming's was tiring, the salary was still quite considerable, even amidst the bad economy. If she left the company, she might not be able to find a good job right after. Although she had saved enough money for her mother's surgery, the recovering expenses was another thing she was unprepared for. Jianyun took a deep breath. At this point, she shouldn't offend Huo Liancheng too much. After all, he currently had the largest shares at Ming's. Whatever he said would surely be followed. It wouldn't be worth it to annoy him over something so trivial. In the end, she conceded. "All right." She quickly gave him the address before adding, "But, President Huo, my face." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Seemingly satisfied with her answer, he hung up. Chapter 33. She accompanied him to the party. Jianyun had originally wanted to tell him that her face was swollen, and that it would be inconvenient for her to accompany him to the banquet, but President Huo hung up the phone before she could finish speaking. At that point, she groaned and slouched back into the cushions. However, she also thought that when he'd see her swollen face, he would change his mind. A small smile crawled into her lips as she clasped her hands together. Maybe there was still hope after all. Not wanting to delay any longer, she entered her mother's room first. There, she saw Auntie Chin tending to her mother's temper as she talked about all the gossip she had picked up around the town. Mrs. John, on the other hand, was propped onto the bed. Her legs were covered under the duvet covers, and her hands were still clenched. She stared right ahead, pretending not to have seen her arrival. "Mom, the company has an emergency," Jianyun said, inching towards the edge of the bed. "I have to head back first." "So fast. Didn't you just come back?" Auntie Chin was the first one to intercept, shaking her head disapprovingly. "I swear, those corporations these days find newer ways to overwork their employees. Couldn't they allow their people to rest on the weekends?" "It's urgent." Even then, the corners of her mouth twitched. In reality, she couldn't help but feel a little resentful towards Huo Liancheng. It wasn't easy for her to come back to Boshan given her hectic schedule, and now that she was finally able to spend more time with her mother, he came looking for her assistance once again? Was he really paying her back for calling him an asshole? Was there a need to stare at her every time they met? "Mom, I won't mention any of those things again. Just, please take good care of your body. You shouldn't worry about the expenses. I can find another way." Seeing that her mother was still ignoring her, Jianyun couldn't help but feel upset. Her heart stirred at the sight, and the pain in her cheek had only grown sharper. When she saw Auntie Chin motioning for her to stop, she conceded. "Mom, you should go to sleep first, okay? I'll go pack my stuff." Without another word, she walked out of the room with her aunt following right behind her. Yun, please don't keep your mother's words to heart. Your father hurt her so much that when she heard you a few minutes ago, she thought you were speaking up to defend him. Auntie Chin sighed, running a hand down her graying hair. Every time the past came back to haunt her, Mrs. Jian would always lash out, but it seemed that this time around she had also affected her daughter. With an aching heart, she brought her hand up to stroke the swollen side of Jian Yun's face. She told me that this was the first time she had ever laid a hand on you, and she regrets it so much. She's hurting right now, just like you. I know, Auntie, it's been hard on you as well. Jian Yun sighed, blinking back the tears. I'm sorry you had to witness that. Be careful on the road, okay, and you should take good care of yourself. Don't exhaust yourself too much. I don't care what that company says. Auntie Chin instructed a few more times before leaving her alone to pack things up. Not having anything to pack, she decided to take this time to place a cold towel over her face to reduce the swelling. She sat for a while, basking in the silence. It had been a long time since she had actually rested like this, where there wasn't much going on in her life. Yet as she sat there, she still couldn't help but feel the exhaustion clutching over her shoulders. With a sigh, Jian Yun shook her head and glanced back at the mirror. Although the marks were still there, the redness had been reduced. She took her bag and was about to say her final goodbyes, but Auntie Chin made a silent gesture that her mother had fallen asleep. Glancing at the two women one last time, she turned around and left. What Jian Yun told Huo Liancheng wasn't exactly their exact address, so she still had to walk a few blocks ahead. Given the state of their home, she didn't want others to know the actual situation she was in, disliking the piteous looks they'd throw at her if they knew. She used this time to call her grandfather to tell him that she still had other matters to attend to for the night. Just as she was about to send a text message to Zhou Xiaolong, she heard someone honking in front of her. Jian Yun looked up to see the familiar Bentley parked in front of her. Huo Liancheng was sitting in the driver's seat, gazing at her with narrowed eyes. Pressing the send button, she hurried into the passenger seat. Huo Liancheng started the car before glancing at her face. What happened? I fell, she lied. I didn't know that the floor has hands, he commented casually. I'm sorry? Jian Yun blinked, furrowing her eyebrows. Otherwise, why would there be a handprint on your face? Although Liancheng wasn't looking at her, she could hear the sardonic tone behind his words. She suppressed the urge to wince and brought a hand up to her cheek. Speechless, Jian Yun didn't say another word, pursing her lips in silence. After all, this wasn't any of his business. Huo Liancheng must have read her thoughts because he didn't pursue this matter any longer. Despite the calming silence, Jian Yun's mind was still in total chaos as she wondered how to bring up the banquet they were heading to. Just then, her phone rang. Peering at the screen, she saw that it was Zhou Xiaolong. She stole a glance at Huo Liancheng, who seemed to be far too focused on driving. She hesitated as her thumb hovered over the answer button as she wondered whether she should pick it up or leave it alone. Why aren't you answering your phone? The rings echoed across the car. Seeing as she was still holding her phone to her chest in a complete daze, he turned towards her. Ah. Jian Yun snapped out of her thoughts, shaking her head. She was obviously overthinking things again. Besides, the phone call had nothing to do with Liancheng. They were only acquaintances, and he probably wouldn't mind if she answered it here. Even if he did mind, why would she care? He was just her boss, nothing more. Mr. Zhao, she greeted, answering the call. You don't have to be so formal. He laughed from the other end of the line. I'm already calling you Jian Yun, so you might as well call me Xiaolong or Zhou Xiaolong. All right then. Jian Yun allowed herself to smile. Mr. Zhou Xiaolong, do you mind if I ask why you called? No reason. I was just wondering if you have time tomorrow. He didn't even ask her why she backed out from her promise. The small disregard heightened her impression of him even more. And the smile on her face brightened. Somehow, the pain in her cheek had vanished for a while as she thought about his question. I have time during the day, but I might have other plans at night. Jian Yun was about to say that she was free, but then remembered that tomorrow was Sunday. Although she didn't have any work-related projects going on, she still had to give piano lessons to her student. Then I'll call you back tomorrow, he offered. All right. Jian Yun wanted to make her mother happy, so she didn't reject Zhou Xiaolong's offer. Besides, he seemed to be a good man. After hanging up the phone, Jian Yun felt the atmosphere between them tense up. The once comforting silence became overwhelming, and when she finally found the courage to glance at the driver's seat, she saw that Liancheng had already worn sunglasses, hiding his sharp gaze. She could only make out the thin line of his lips right under his high nose. Despite this, she still felt uneasy. President Huo, she uttered, mustering up the courage to ask. My face is swollen. I think it would be inconvenient for me to accompany you to the banquet. It's fine, Huo Liancheng snapped. She wanted to persuade him otherwise, but upon seeing his face darken at her words, she decided to swallow her words and turn away. Forget it. Besides, she was already in his car anyway. Backing out from the party was already far too late. The car sped across the highway as the afternoon sunlight shone through the window pane. Its warm light highlighted her dark hair and added more color to her pale face. With a sigh, she peered out of the window, noticing the lack of other cars on the road. Huo Liancheng didn't say anything else after that. Not knowing how to talk to him, Jian Yun could only prop up her chin near the door and stare blankly at the bright sceneries ahead of them. The high mountain tops and bright blue skies greeted her sights, and her eyes glimmered. However, the sense of peace lasted for only a me before a sense of skepticism rushed through her. Now, Jian Yun was even more confused as to what Huo Liancheng was thinking. She didn't think he liked her. Except for the kiss back in the elevator, he still treated her with the same usual indifference and made no other moves to pursue her. Yet, it seemed that they keep running into each other every now and then. Right now, she still didn't know if his appearance in Boshan was coincidental or deliberate on his part. She licked her lips apprehensively, feeling her hairs stand at the back of her neck. Furthermore, she couldn't help but remember Xia Bingbing and her unborn child. At the thought, her blood boiled. He may be rich and handsome, but he was still a jerk for not wanting to be responsible for her pregnancy. Even if he was interested in her, she wouldn't be moved by him. The 2-hour ride passed by very quickly. Along the way, Jian Yun had already dozed off. She could vaguely hear Liancheng speaking on the phone before a buzz of silence shadowed over her. When the car had finally stopped, she glanced at her watch to see that it was already 3:30. She turned around and found that the car was parked by the side of an unknown road. In a few seconds, they were met with a suited man, holding a small item in his hand. Before Jian Yun could ask where they were, Liancheng got off the car and chatted with the man walking towards them. The man seemed to have passed him the vial and was about to walk towards the car as if to get a better look at the passenger. However, he didn't get the chance. Huo Liancheng quickly blocked his direction and stepped back into the car. Not bothering to say his farewells, he slammed onto the gas and sped away. Jian Yun could hear the man cursing from afar. "After everything I've done for you, Huo Liancheng, you're so mean." "Here," he handed her a small porcelain bottle as if nothing had happened. "What's this?" She pulled the cork from the bottle, and a fresh fragrance entered her nostrils. "Is it food?" Huo Liancheng looked at her with a deadpan expression, as if trying to suppress his annoyance. "It's for your face." Her face flushed dark red in embarrassment, and she turned away. Taking the makeup kit from her bag, she picked up the light green ointment and applied it to her cheek. Although the redness had been reduced because of the cold towel, it was still a bit swollen. As the ointment grazed her skin, a cool and comfortable feeling slid down her face. Chapter 34. Are you with young Master Huo? As soon as Jian Yun had applied the ointment, the burning sensation on the side of her face had disappeared. Instead, it was replaced with a cool feeling, as if she had dipped herself in a bucket of ice-cold water. It didn't even have the standard bitter smell that most ointments have. The fragrant scent of lotus flowers entered her nostrils, hugging the sides of her face like a soft breeze. "What kind of ointment is this?" Jian Yun couldn't help but exclaim as she stared at the ointment in her hand, trying to find a significant trademark. Her eyes glimmered with admiration. This was probably the best ointment she had ever tried. "The effects are amazing, and it doesn't hurt anymore. Do you know where else I could buy it?" "Really? Let me have a look." Just as they had reached a stoplight, he bent over and held her delicate chin, turning her towards him. His thumb stroked her skin, observing the fading mark on the side of her face. A soft buzz filled her eardrums. There was something about the way he had turned her that seemed so natural, like they were any other couple just going on a date. Her eyes widened momentarily as her hands lay on her lap, as if frozen into place. When Jian Yun finally came to her senses, they were already millimeters apart. At a closer glance, she could even see her own reflection in his dark eyes. His hot breath fanned her face, and a burning feeling coursed through her entire system. Somehow, his gaze didn't seem as cold as it had been from afar. In fact, it was hiding a little bit of warmth, one that she didn't expect to see. She slowly turned her head and tried to break free from Huo Liancheng's hand. However, no matter how much she pulled and turned, she was still unable to break free from his hold. The back of her head was pressed against the corner between the seat and the car window, and if possible, he had inched even closer to her. She waited in bated breath. Beads of sweat rolled down the back of her neck, and her legs quaked as various thoughts entered her mind. Was he going to kiss her again? But they didn't even know each other that well. Hell, they weren't even friends. Was this his way of trying to flirt with her? President Huo. Jian Yun stared at his nose, not daring to look at him in the eye. She wanted to tell him that the stoplight was about to turn green, but she found herself a little bit tongue-tied. Her fingertips tugged the fabric of her shirt, as if trying to get her to snap out of it. "You're right, your face isn't swelling anymore." However, Huo Liancheng didn't kiss her as she had expected. Instead, he slowly let her go and let his eyes turn to the road ahead of them. The green light had turned on, and right on time, he leaned back against the driver's seat and drove the car past the intersection. It was as if nothing had happened. Jian Yun clawed on her chest, trying to calm her beating heart. Her eyebrows furrowed together as she tried to register what just happened. What the hell did President Huo mean? Her fingers brushed against her lips. Why did he have to lean in so close to her just to say that the swelling had subsided? Couldn't he have noticed that from afar? He must have done that on purpose. To make a fool out of herself. She had been too busy making faces at her own reflection, venting her dissatisfaction with the entire ordeal, that she had forgotten that there was someone sitting right beside her. Huo Liancheng could see all funny expressions from his rear-view mirror, watching her range from feelings of frustration to anger all in one go. He retracted his gaze, and the corners of his lips inched upwards. You can't buy the ointment anywhere else, he later offered after a moment of silence. If you like it so much, I can get Yin Che to make some more for you. No, please. I don't want to trouble you. Hearing this, Jian Yun bowed her head and waved her hand. It wouldn't be right to ask a favor this large from him, as they weren't all that familiar with each other. Huo Liancheng simply glanced back at her and said nothing more. Yet, no matter how many minutes had passed, Jian Yun still couldn't calm herself. From time to time, she would look at Liancheng's direction and feel her heart beat even faster than the last. It was like a curse in the making. It was obvious that she didn't like him, but why was she so affected by his presence? She rubbed her chest, shaking her thoughts away. It was best to keep her distance, otherwise she'd die from a heart attack. Have your hands recovered? He steadily steered the wheel to the right. What? Jian Yun blinked. When she saw him eyeing her left hand, she immediately remembered her blisters from the night before. She raised it up into the air and showed it to him. Although the blisters had faded, there were still scars to remind her of what had happened. The doctor had said that it would take some more time for them to fade completely. It's already scarring. The ointment can remove the scars as well. Oh. Thank you. Although the tension had disappeared, the awkwardness still floated around the car like a heavy blanket. Her hand fidgeted, and she found herself inching closer and closer to the car door. When she looked up, she saw that they were already heading towards the city center. Her eyebrows furrowed over. Were they already heading to the party? But it was too early. President Huo, where are we going now? We're going to pick up some clothes for you, he responded. There's really no need. I already have a dress, Jian Yun tried to say, but one glance from him made her shut her mouth. She shook her head repeatedly. Pretend I didn't say anything. This time, she didn't hold any suspicions in her heart. After all, they won't be attending just any regular party. If she had any guesses, she could bet that 100% of the guests who would be going would be decked with designer clothing from head to toe. If she dressed too poorly for the night, she'd be the highlight of the night, and not in a good way either. After 20 minutes, they had finally arrived at a building. After stepping out of the car, he led her to the 12th floor. Immediately, as the elevator doors opened, someone came up to them and bowed respectfully. Mr. Huo? He greeted with so much pretense and respect that Jian Yun thought he was greeting the emperor. This way, please. Jian Yun followed behind him and looked around curiously. With dozens of racks at either side of the room and large posters of models up on the walls, she could tell it was a clothing studio. Various fabrics were laid out in display, and even she couldn't help but swoon at the sight. Some of these fabrics were exclusive and rare, one that she couldn't even dream of wearing. What the hell was she doing here? Hearing the voice from the other end, the double doors opened and a fashionably dressed woman came striding out. The moment she saw Liancheng, her eyes lit up and her arms opened wide. She rushed over, like a mother reuniting with her son, yelling out, "It's really you, Mr. Huo?" When Cheng Mu's called in to say that you were coming, I didn't believe him at first, but here you are. Liancheng dodged her bear hug and placed an arm around Jian Yun's shoulder, pushing her forward. "Oh, Shreli," he greeted, "I need you to pick out a set of clothes for her." The woman was hiding behind his back this entire time, that Shreli didn't even notice her. When Jian Yun was brought forward, she clasped her hands together in surprise. "Such a pretty little girl. Where did you find her?" Taking her arm affectionately, Shreli cooed. "You can call me Shirley, okay? Just give me an hour, Mr. Huo, and I'll transform this sweet little girl into a goddess." Without much of a warning, Jian Yun was pulled into the room. She couldn't help but look back at Huo Liancheng, who was also gazing at her. There was so much intensity in his eyes that she couldn't help but shiver. Yet a part of her was fine with it. This was far better than the coldness that had greeted her any other day. Shreli happened to turn around just in time to see the two staring at each other like a pair of lovebirds. Smiling secretly, she closed the door. "What's your name?" Shreli quickly called over her two assistants. One of them immediately started brushing Jian Yun's hair, while the other brought out a large makeup kit. "Jian Yun." She smiled, not being able to help it. Their enthusiasm was far too infectious. "Are you and Mr. Huo together?" Shreli and her assistants all asked at the same time, as they thought of various styles they could try with her long hair. "No," she sputtered out, trying to get a hold of herself. Why did everyone assume they were together? It wasn't as if they acted as if they were together. "He's the CEO of the company where I work. I can't possibly be with him." "Really?" Shreli squinted her eyes, chuckling. She began to comb her hair, separating them into thinner strands. But I feel like Mr. Huo treats you differently than any other woman he's met. In fact, you're the first woman he ever brought to my place. Jian Yun blinked. Doesn't he stay overseas? Who says so? She snorted, shaking her head. I swear the man had done tons of crazy things in the last few years. Not only had he left his own company, which for your information, has a net value of over trillions of dollars, but he also became a professional manager for God knows what reason. Says he wanted to challenge himself, but I doubt that the reasoning is that simple. To be honest with you, he seems to be looking for someone. Looking for someone? Jian Yun's heart skipped a beat. That's what my husband says. They came from the same family, Wu Shuili hurriedly explained before sighing. But after seeing how detached he is, that reasoning is somehow hard to believe. Jian Yun didn't know why she was saying all of these things to her, but she also didn't ask any further. After all, she didn't want to invade the Liancheng's privacy. It took both of the assistants more than an hour to fix her hair and makeup. By the time they were finished, Wu Shuili pulled out a black fishtailed dress from the racks. It was a backless, low-cut dress that almost leaves nothing to the imagination. When Jian Yun put it on, the silky dress hugged her on all the right sides, that even the assistants gasped in surprise. Sister Jian, it's like the outfit was made for you. We should let Mr. Huo look for himself. Wu Shuili pushed her towards the doorway, sounding even more excited than Jian Yun. Wait, isn't this too much? Jian Yun gazed at her exposed cleavage, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Although the dress looked beautiful, it was far too revealing for her taste. A blush crept up to her cheeks as she struggled to cover herself. Chapter 35. Stunning. Of course not. Not showing off that figure of yours would be much more of a waste. Wu Shuili patted Jian Yun's butt before shoving her out of the room. Immediately, all of her assistants crowded around the background, holding their breaths in anticipation. Even the middle-aged woman was anxious as she called out, Mr. Huo, why don't you have a look? Are you satisfied? Jian Yun turned bright red at the woman's words. She tried her best to cover her plunging neckline or her incredibly low back, but it was useless. The more she moved, the tighter the dress became. Seeing that nothing was working, she gave up and stood still instead. When Huo Liancheng heard the door creak open, he turned his head, and the sight rendered him silent. It was like seeing the northern lights for the first time, with all of its grandeur and beauty wrapped into a single woman. The dark dress elevated her flawless skin, looking like the midnight calm before the flashy lights. Wu Shuili didn't bother tying her hair up in a formal knot, as she had done with most of her clients. Instead, she braided the woman's hair into soft plaits, falling naturally down her back. The sides behind her ears were embellished with white and pink pearls, making her look as if she had come fresh out of the sea. Jian Yun, in contrast to her previous naturally disheveled look, became a refined beauty, one that could pass off as a daughter of some aristocratic family. Mr. Huo, I didn't put on too much makeup, since it would just hide her natural beauty. So I put just enough of eyeshadow and powder to highlight the features she already has. Wu Shuili secretly smiled at the sight of his expression. She didn't need to be a psychiatrist to know what the man was thinking. Even the most aloof man couldn't totally hide his composure at the sight of a beautiful woman. Huo Liancheng didn't say anything. All he could do was stare at her low-cut dress. Her shoulders were completely exposed, all the way down to her back, and the mere sight had pierced his eyes red. He took a deep breath. Jian Yun had only glanced up at him once before quickly lowering her head. There was something about his gaze that held so much passion that it had caused her heart to beat even more wildly. Her hands lay slack on her sides as tension crawled up her neck. This was the first time she had seen so much emotion on President Huo's face that she couldn't help but wonder. She shook her head. Suddenly feeling conscious, she tried to lift up her top. Don't be so old-fashioned. Seeing this, Wu Shuili hurriedly tried to pull her hands away, but Jian Yun still refused to listen. As Jian pulled her clothes upwards, a loud scream came from her back that she almost yelled out in surprise. She had almost torn off the dress. One of her hands rested on her chest, while the other searched the back area to see if there were any rips. Her face turned as bright as a tomato, especially hearing an unnatural cough from the other end of the room. Although Liancheng didn't say a word, she could tell that he was laughing at her from the inside. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing that there was some hole to shield her from the embarrassment. Wu Shuili held back her laughter and shook her head. It's fine. The dress is okay, she said playfully before clasping her hands. Now, what's your shoe size? Wait. It was then when he finally opened his mouth. Do you have any more requests, Mr. Huo? Wu Shuili asked smugly, satisfied with the way the makeover had gone. Huo Liancheng squinted at her exposed back and a tight corset before looking away. Change her clothes, he commanded in a deep voice, much to Jian Yun's relief. What? Even the assistants were surprised, their eyebrows furrowed over, puzzled by the man's request. But it's so beautiful. Change her clothes, he repeated, pursing his lips. There was a certain tightness in his features that almost seemed unnatural. Wu Shuili followed his gaze and immediately understood what he meant. Although the dress had highlighted all her good features, it may have highlighted them far too much for his liking. It was too revealing. Conceding, she clasped her hands together. Well, as they say, the customer's always right. Sister Jan, let's change your clothes. Jian Yun had to resist the urge to breathe a sigh of relief. If she had gone out in this dress, she wouldn't know what to do. This was the first time she had agreed with him. This time, Ushueli settled in picking another dress. Its faint rose color shone under the artificial lights. It was still a fishtailed skirt design, and there were hand-embroidered roses along the top, showing the intricacy of the fabric. The one-shoulder dress was sweet and elegant, far better than the sexy and revealing feel of the former dress. Jian Yun came out again, more comfortable than she had been the last time. As she stared at the mirror, a small smile slid into her lips. This was far more captivating than the previous dress, that was for sure, and it fitted her personality quite well. Seeing this, Liancheng was satisfied. With a grin, Ushueli waved at her assistants to get the accessories. There's no need. Huo Liancheng waved his hand dismissively. Ushueli narrowed her eyes. What? Do you think my necklace is too cheap for you liking? Ignoring her, he walked over to Jen's side and pulled out a jewelry box from his pockets. The soft velvety box caught everyone's eyes, and they all couldn't help but lean closer to see what was inside. When it was opened, a shot of dazzling light flashed from the shadows, revealing a blood-red diamond necklace. When Ushueli saw the necklace, she couldn't help but gasp. Isn't that from the previous auction? She silenced herself upon catching sight of Liancheng's cold gaze. While everyone was too surprised to even speak, he took this opportunity to pull out the delicate necklace from the box and motioned it towards her. Although Jian Yun didn't know much about luxury items, she wasn't that ignorant. She could tell that colored diamonds were far more precious and valuable than the colorless ones, especially if it was a pink diamond. And from what she could tell from Ushueli's exaggerated gasp, the necklace was probably worth more than what normal privileged people could afford. When she saw that Liancheng had already pulled the necklace out of the box and aimed to place it around her neck, she was even more surprised. Stuttering, she dodged from his arms. President Huo, it's far too expensive. I can't. You're my date for the night. Do you want me to lose face? Despite her protests, he still remained unmoved. This time, even Jian Yun had stopped talking. However, when Huo Liancheng stood close to her to put it on, she could feel a slight shudder running through her body as his breath fanned against her neck. Even her legs seemed to have wobbled from the certain weight that the necklace had brought. She blinked. It was as if this was all just a dream, one that she almost didn't want to wake up to. As he was clicking it all into place, his warm fingers would brush up against her skin, and she stiffened. Although it was just a few seconds since he had pulled out the necklace, she had felt that almost a century had passed. Once he had finally pulled away, his large hands grasped her on the shoulders and directed her towards the mirror. The reflection was the one that had surprised her the most. He was standing right behind her, with her back up against his broad chest. Even in her high heels, she was only about the same height as his chin. Yet, that wasn't what had her attention. In their reflection, she couldn't help but be drawn towards his dark, burning eyes. There was a certain emotion hidden behind its depths that she couldn't comprehend. Her heart stirred in her chest. Under the warm lights, the pink diamond glittered against her milky white skin, elevating the intricacy of her gown. Immediately, Jian Yun lowered her gaze, not daring to meet him in the eye. At that moment, she could feel his hand tightening around her shoulders. Well, Mr. Huo, is she good for the ball? She still needs some earrings. When Ushueli saw his expression, she immediately knew what was going on. Hiding her smile, handed him a pair of earrings. However, he had already lost interest. Not taking the earrings from the woman's hand, he turned around and walked away. Help her wear them. And you say that Mr. Huo doesn't like you? Ushueli teased as she put on the earrings. The way he was looking at you a while ago makes it seem as if he wants to ravish you right then and there. Don't talk nonsense. Jian Yun blushed even more, clenching her fists. Huo Liancheng leaned against the doorway, glancing at his wristwatch every now and then. A minute had passed and he arched an eyebrow at the two women by the mirror. Are you done? Let's go. Take care of yourself, Sister Jian. Squeezing her hand, Ushueli winked before turning to the man. Mr. Huo, I'll ask someone to send you the bill, okay? Seeing that he had already walked away, Jian ran up to catch up to him. It had been a long time since she had worn such high heels, and after running a few steps, she stumbled forward. Crap. Her eyes squeezed shut as she waited for her ultimate doom. But before she could even fall, a large hand swooped around her waist to stop her just in time. When she raised her head, she was met with Liancheng's cold eyes. It seemed he had stopped and turned while she was running. Thank you. Straightening her back, she removed his hand away from her. He didn't say anything else and continued to walk forward. However, this time, he slowed down his pace. As they walked away, Ushueli quickly took out her phone and made a call. Hubby, she exclaimed, lowering her voice into a whisper. You won't believe what I just saw today. Yes, I just met Mr. Huo's girlfriend. Once they had gotten into the car, Huo Liancheng was even more silent than before. He kept his mouth tightly shut and didn't say another word the entire ride. Although Jian Yun had accompanied her father to business banquets back when she was a young teen, that had been so many years ago. And this was a far different crowd than what she had experienced back then. She anxiously rubbed her hand against the soft fabric. When the car finally stopped in front of a villa, Huo Liancheng finally turned towards her. "Don't worry, just follow my lead. Okay?" Even then, her nervousness wasn't eased. Once they had entered the villa, a maid immediately came up to them to lead the way into the ballroom. Suddenly, Jian Yun, who had her head lowered the entire time, noticed that Liancheng stopped. When she glanced up, she saw that he had already bent his arm and motioned her to come closer. With a moment's hesitation, she slowly placed her arm around his. Chapter 36, Hand-holding for the first time. As they walked towards the ballroom, Jian Yun couldn't help but admire the brightly lit villa. Everywhere she looked, she saw chandeliers falling from the high ceilings, glittering bright gold as they shone across the embellished floorings. The engraved walls and expensive paintings were placed in distinctive places, enough to draw a certain aesthetic that guests young and old could admire. As she glanced at the side, she could see that everyone was extremely well dressed, suited for the glamour of the event. It was a good thing she hadn't worn the dress she had back at home. No wonder Huo Liancheng was so cautious about the way she looked. With his identity, if his date had dressed poorly for the night, it would have been embarrassing for him. As soon as they appeared, everyone paused and turned. The loud chatter that filled the hallway had gone silent, as every single one of the guests gaped at the pair. The man was tall and handsome, while the woman was soft and alluring. From afar, they were like a match made from heaven. "President Huo, we meet at last." A chunky man in his 50s approached him with his date wrapped around his arms. "I've heard so much about you." "Director Mo, so this is the famous President Huo. He's even more handsome than he was on TV." The woman beside him looked to be in her early 20s. Although she was beautiful, it was her glistening jewelry that stole the limelight. Embellished in emeralds and diamonds, she looked like she had all the jewelry in the world wrapped around her wrists and neck, overwhelming her subtle beauty. "President Huo, I've seen your exclusive interview in Finance and Economics, and it's really interesting. I admire your research on the subject." There was something about the woman's honey-sweet voice that didn't sit well with Jian Yun. However, no matter how much flattery they threw at him, Jian Yun realized that Huo Liancheng couldn't even be bothered to smile. Instead, he just nodded in greeting, like an emperor acknowledging his subjects. Yet, Director Mo didn't seem to care. He followed behind Huo Liancheng silently, not really knowing what else to say. Seeing as he didn't get a response from the man himself, he turned his gaze towards Jian Yun, only to blink in surprise. "Is this your date, President Huo? She's so beautiful." While Liancheng was indifferent and detached, Jian Yun was the complete opposite. Being heavily praised in front of so many people, she couldn't help but blush and turn away, not knowing how to act. Hearing the man's praise, the woman turned her attention to Jian Yun before her gaze fell on the glittering necklace resting on her chest. Immediately, she gasped and cried out, "Isn't that the lover's heart?" Her eyes were filled with surprise and envy for the woman wearing them. Lover's heart? When Jian Yun heard the name, she lowered her head to look at the vibrant necklace. The diamond glinted under the lights, glowing in bright pink. The name was rather fitting, yet as she turned away and gazed up at President Huo, an unfamiliar feeling settled in her stomach. In the next few seconds, there were so many people who came up to greet them. As the crowd around them grew larger and larger, Director Mo was soon pushed to the side. No one paid any heed to him, given that his position wasn't that high enough amongst the crowd. As Jian Yun glanced around, she had recognized their faces from all the financial magazines. The others were even old-time tycoons who had been on plenty of news programs. She stood agape, as these influential men all bowed and greeted Liancheng as if he was their god. Was he really that famous? Not knowing much about finances, she found herself a little bit bored by their conversation. Removing her arm from his, she glanced around the room, wanting to look for a space with fewer people. However, just as she had pulled out her arm, it was grabbed right back. This time, he held her hand tightly, refusing to let go. This was the first time he had ever held her before, and she could feel the warmth radiating from his palm. Her thumb grazed across his knuckles. "President Huo." Her face burned a little, trying to pull away a few times, but it seemed that her resistance had only encouraged him. He immediately intertwined his fingers with hers, turning away from the crowd. Jian Yun couldn't just fling her hand away and cause a scene. Not only would this embarrass her, but this could make him lose face, which would be even more drastic for her career. No matter how the outcome would go, it wouldn't look good for any of them. And even if she did use her full strength, her chances of escaping were still slim. With no other choice, she maintained the intimate gesture by interlocking her fingers with him. The pair stood side by side as they faced the incoming ground, making for a beautiful sight. In the eyes of outsiders, the hand-holding held a far deeper meaning. There was a certain way they held themselves that others couldn't help but swoon at the sight of the young couple. It was truly a sweet gesture. The woman beside President Huo is gorgeous. Why haven't I seen her before? Sooner or later, the crowd started asking about their relationship, trying to dig out any details that the other guests may have about them. Isn't that pink diamond the lover's heart? One of the women brought up, gasping in surprise. They all shared a look. I remembered that the necklace had been sold to a mysterious buyer back at the Sotheby's auction a year ago. It seems that we know who the buyer is now. At this point, everyone had already assumed what type of relationship they had. After all, the lover's heart was already self-explanatory. Cheers, President Huo! A few men came forward, one of them clasping him on the shoulder. They laughed, nodding appreciatively at the woman standing beside him. Who knew that you have amazing taste in women? Your girlfriend's beautiful. Jian Yun frowned upon hearing this. She thought that Huo Liancheng would deny her being his girlfriend, but he simply smiled in appreciation. The act left her baffled. Why wasn't he correcting them? Just as she was about to say something to interrupt them, the crowd around them had dispersed. Mr. Bai is here. Jin Yun followed all their odd stares and saw an old man holding a walking stick. Beside him was a young woman who assisted him down the steps. Even if she didn't care much about the business sector, she could tell with a glance that Mr. Bai was a world-renowned businessman. He was the wealthiest man across eastern China and has been known to be a famous philanthropist. His company, Bai Lichuan, was one of the top companies in the country. Immediately, Huo Liancheng straightened his back and pulled her towards the center. Let's go greet them. Grandpa Bai. Gone was his cold and aloof demeanor, and instead, it was replaced with warmth and respect. The way he had addressed him in comparison to the other men who had greeted him showed that the two were close friends. Huo Liancheng, you've been at Qinghu for a few days, and you still haven't come to greet me. Bai Lichuan shook his head playfully, reaching out to pat him on the shoulder. You don't even know how many times Fei asked me to call you every single day just to get you to visit. Grandpa, stop talking nonsense. The young girl assisting him earlier was none other than his granddaughter, Bai Shui. She waved her hand coquettishly, fluttering her eyelashes. However, when she saw their interlocked hands, a small crease appeared on her forehead. How is your grandfather recently? He's doing quite fine. The two men exchanged a few pleasantries, but even then, Bai Shui couldn't be sated. She stared at the quiet young woman standing right beside him and raised her eyebrows. Big brother Liancheng, who's this? It was only through her granddaughter's question did the old man also notice Jian Yun. His gaze fell on their entwined fingers, and his eyes lit up. The young girl was beautiful. How could he not have noticed her until now? Bai Lichuan pushed his lips, appearing disgruntled. It seemed that the girl knew how to blend in the crowd. It's lovely to meet you, Mr. Bai, Jian Yun greeted respectfully. I came with President Huo. Are you his girlfriend then? Bai Shui glanced at her questioningly. Trying to mask the bitterness in her heart, she giggled and winked. He never holds hands with any girl I've seen before, so I'm guessing you're his girlfriend. Miss Bai, you guessed wrong. Jian Yun smiled, but as soon as the words slipped past her lips, she could feel him tighten his hold. Ow! She jolted up in surprise, crying out in pain. It hurts. Although Huo Liancheng didn't say anything in reply, he loosened his grip. Even then, he still didn't let her go. The action wasn't left unnoticed by Bai Lichuan. You should just admit it, Sister Jian. Otherwise, Brother Liancheng might throw a fit. Bai Shui looked back and forth between the couple before her gaze fell on the lover's heart. Immediately, her eyes flashed in disbelief. Could it be? Oh, I'm really not. From the moment she had arrived, Jian Yun could already see the hostility wafting from the two of them. She stared at the old man, noticing the way he had tightened his hold around his walking stick. If she had guessed right, then Bai Shui must be interested in Liancheng, and Bai Lichuan was trying to set them up. Even if she was his girlfriend, she definitely wasn't admitting it to them, or else they'd tear her alive. Chapter 37, Lover's Heart. Jian Yun's continuous denials only dug her a deeper grave. Huo Liancheng didn't say a word, but anyone who'd look at his face could see that he wasn't pleased with this. However, Bai Shui wasn't listening to either of them anymore. Instead, her envious gaze was fixated on the necklace, as she thought of how important could the woman be to him. The atmosphere had turned awkward, and none of them said a word, as if waiting for the other to speak. Just then, a familiar voice rang from the other side of the room. Why are you all standing there? Grandpa Bai, you're the host tonight, and you didn't even bother to greet me, and here I was looking for you this entire time. It was Cheng Muzi. Jian Yun immediately turned around to see the bespectacled man standing next to Huo Liancheng with a glass of wine in his hand. When Cheng Muzi glanced at her, his eyes lit up and he didn't even try to hide his astonishment. Raising his glass even higher, he praised. Sister Jian is so pretty today. Definitely puts your date to shame. As he said those words, he threw her a wink. For a moment, the grandeur of the party was lost to her as Jian Yun burst into laughter. This was the first time she had been this relaxed this entire day, and just as she was about to say something in return, she noticed that Liancheng's grip had tightened even more. She closed her mouth and stayed silent. Brother Chen is so biased. When Bai Shui saw him praising Jian Yun, she pouted. Am I not beautiful enough to catch your attention? Ah, so this is the pretty Bai Shui everyone's been talking about. I couldn't even recognize you. Cheng Mu's gasped exasperatedly, covering his mouth. Tapping her head lightly, he reached over and kissed the back of her hand. It's been a long time since I've seen you. you've grown even more beautiful with each passing year. You don't have to exaggerate. Rolling her eyes at him, Baishe pulled her hand away and affectionately held on to Jianyun's arm like a little child. It seems that all the men are here. Why don't we go somewhere more quiet to grab a bite? Then she tilted her head at Huo Liancheng, smiling innocently. Brother Liancheng, do you mind if I steal your girlfriend for a second? Although he frowned in reply, he didn't refuse her. Sure, just don't go too far. Seeing as he finally let go of her hand, Jianyun secretly felt relieved. Not having the time or even the heart to correct Baishui's words anymore, she pinched her numb wrist and greeted Mr. Bai one last time before she was pulled towards the other direction. Huo Liancheng watched their retreating figure. It was only when Bai Lichuan had coughed did he finally turn away. Liancheng, come with me. There is something I want to ask you. Despite being surprised by the woman's presence, he still kept his composure. The old man motioned his walking stick towards a more secluded location before glancing at Cheng Mu's. You should come too. On the other side of the ballroom, Bai Shui passed her a plate as they stood over the wide table. She looked over the various delicacies available for them and grabbed a macaroon from one of the silverware. So, Sister Jian, she started casually, how did you and Brother Liancheng meet? Jianyun immediately flashed back to the time she had cursed at him before shaking her head. Their first introduction was best kept to herself. Besides, even if she did say it, the Bai Shui wouldn't even believe her. Picking up a few pastries from one of the glass trays, she replied, I'm an employee at Ming's, so we met at work. At work? The young woman blinked in surprise. Didn't he just come back to Qinghu City a few days ago? So you only knew each other for a few days? That's right. Jianyun picked up a slice of cake. Today had been so hectic that she had forgotten to eat. So you're really not his girlfriend? Seeing the seriousness in Jianyun's face, she couldn't help but blink in disbelief. Bai Shui glanced at her necklace every now and then before shaking her head. Liancheng had never brought a date in these types of functions before, and to see him bring a woman he had known for only a couple of days. But that's impossible. If you're not his girlfriend, how could he give you the lover's heart? Miss Bai, what did you say? Moi. Guests had started to arrive that their own voices had been drowned out by ecstatic laughter and loud chatter. Not hearing her, Jianyun furrowed her eyebrows and turned back. It's nothing. Noticing that Cheng Mu's was heading towards them, she quieted down. Hey, Brother Cheng, weren't you just talking with Brother Liancheng and Grandpa? There are so many people trying to get a piece of your big brother Liancheng that I didn't bother to stay. Besides, it's far better to stand near the dessert table. The corners of his lips twitched upwards as he grabbed a glass of fruit wine from the tray. His smile widened so much that his eyes slanted even more. Try this, Sister Jian. I don't drink. She waved her hand. It's not wine, he explained, chuckling. It's brewed with rose dew, so not only is it fine, but it's healthy too. Taste it. Some might say it's the best tasting drink they ever had. Her throat had been scratchy from not drinking any water the entire day that she didn't even bother questioning him even further. Her fingers wrapped around the glass as she brought the rim to her lips. The faint sweetness of the drink wrapped around her tongue and her eyes closed. It didn't have the alcoholic tinge that was usually present in many strong drinks. In fact, it was quite delicious. What did I tell you? Seeing her satisfied expression, he clasped his hands in satisfaction and handed her another cup. Why don't you have another? Sister Jian, you shouldn't listen to him. Although the fruit wine is delicious, it could make people drunk with just a few glasses. Not knowing what his purpose was, Bai Shui was quick to remind them. However, Jianyun wasn't listening to her any longer, too engrossed in the drink in her hands. You shouldn't drink too much in one go. Nonsense, it's fine. Cheng Mu's shot her a glare, as if trying to tell her that she shouldn't interfere. Whatever. Making a face, Bai Shui turned away. The dance is about to begin, so I better prepare myself. She had always liked Liancheng ever since she was young. In fact, she had proclaimed her love for him when she was just 10. Cheng Mu's watched the young woman as she gave her opening speech. There was a certain elegance with the way she had held herself in front of the crowd that had everyone entranced. But if she continues this path, she's destined to be disappointed. And why is that? Miss Bai is cute and bubbly, and her family's not short of money. They're quite compatible. Jianyun took another sip from her cup, grasping another glass from his hand. It seemed that with each glass she had taken, her mind had grown even clearer. Blinking, she followed his gaze and stared at the young woman. But Mr. Huo likes women who are proud yet quiet like orchids blooming on a cliff. Someone who's willing to stand up to him, unashamed yet somewhat unprepared. There was a certain meaning hidden behind his words as he stared at the necklace on her neck. Jianyun smiled, pretending that she didn't understand. Just then, Bai Lichuan had also finished his speech, and the orchestra soon started. Its soft strums echoed across the hall, and the crowd soon dispersed, leaving a wide space in the center. Given her experience in attending these types of banquets, she knew that this was the beginning of a dance. Huo Liancheng was tonight's most important guests. Given that he was also well connected with Mr. Bai, he was supposed to start off the opening dance. Although he had brought his girlfriend along, everyone felt that no matter what, he should begin the opening dance with Miss Vi. After all, that was proper etiquette. Even Bai Shui knew this. Her bright blue dress glittered under the lights, making her look as beautiful as a blooming flower. Her eyes glinted with excitement as she stood at the side of the room, waiting for him to invite her for the first dance. However, Huo Liancheng didn't even glance at her way, much to her surprise and disappointment. Instead, he walked directly to the dessert table, to where Jian Yun was standing. Silence descended into the hall as everyone turned towards the couple. Their eyes were wide, and their mouths were agape. They watched him walk towards her and extended his hand to where she was standing. Everyone held their breath. For a split second, Jian Yun felt her heart speeding in her chest. When she raised her head, she found herself a little lost in his dark eyes. He was so focused on her that the coldness of his features was nowhere to be seen. Instead of feeling uncomfortable like she had been every time they caught sight of each other, this time she felt warm. She forced herself to turn away. "Sorry, President Huo." She smiled apologetically. "I don't know how to dance." However, Huo Liancheng still didn't withdraw his hand. "I'll teach you," he said in a deep voice. Chapter 38. If you have deep feelings, drink it all in one gulp. Out of the corner of her eyes, Jian Yun could see Bai Shui's clenched fists and Bai Lichuan's furrowed eyebrows. Although she was a bad experience with the finer things in life, she knew for a fact that since the old man was the host of today's banquet, they'd lose face if their most important guest wouldn't invite them to dance. All eyes were on her, waiting for her answer with bated breath. It had been 6 years since the last time she had been the center of everyone's attention. Back then, she had people at her beck and call, people who showered her with gifts and praises. Yet, reality had slammed her right on the face. Now she blended with the crowd, a wallflower amongst her coworkers, and that was fine. Making her mother happy was the driving force behind her life, and that had kept her going. But ever since she met him, he had pulled her out of the shadows, making her the center of attention. Finally, all eyes were on her, and the silent wallflower was suddenly ripped from the walls and pushed under the spotlight. The uneasiness crept up to her neck, and her breath hitched. Jian Yun stepped back and forced a smile on her lips. "I'm a bit slow, President Huo. It won't be good if I step on you throughout the dance." Immediately after her words, Huo Liancheng's face darkened and the atmosphere around him turned as cold as ice. She suddenly took interest in the intricate floorings, no longer looking up at him. Despite this, her fingers twisted around the fabric of her dress, and she resisted the urge to sigh. When the surrounding people had heard of this, they all shared glances. It was hard to tell whether they were relieved or disappointed that there wasn't any drama fest for them to enjoy. Yet, as they spotted Bai Lichuan's loosening hold around his walking stick, it was probably the better option. For Bai Shui, this was undoubtedly good news. Since Jian Yun didn't know how to dance, then she'd be Huo Liancheng's partner for the opening dance. As the strums of the classical violin bounced across the halls, Liancheng didn't insist any further and walked away. In the end, he had invited Bai Shui to the dance. Soon enough, the drama had disappeared in all the guests' minds, as they stood in awe of the twirling pair in the center of the ballroom. Jian Yun used this time to drift farther from the dance floor and nearer to the dance floor. She took a sip from her fruit wine, observing the dimming lights. "Sister Jian, do you know that you're the first one who has ever dared to refuse Mr. Huo?" Not joining in the dance, Cheng Mu stood beside her. There was awe revealed in his voice as he gazed at her. "It's not that I refused," she scoffed. "It's just that I didn't know how to dance. Sister Jian, I couldn't help but be a little curious." Glancing meaningfully at the lover's heart, he pursed his lips. "Watching Mr. Huo dancing with all these women, wouldn't you be jealous? Not even a little bit?" She burst into laughter, almost choking in her wine. Her bright eyes glittered under the artificial lights, yet there was a certain flash of emotion within its depths, one that she wasn't aware of. "Why would I? Are you really talking about me liking Mr. Huo, practically the richest man alive? I would dream that high." "Then what do you dream? To work hard and study harder, of course." Jian Yun winked playfully. At the sight of his furrowed eyebrows, she bumped shoulders with him and laughed. The stiffness she had from her earlier refusal had loosened, and as she observed the crowd around her, she noticed that many of the lights had grown blurry. She pursed her lips and took a sip. "Don't you dream high?" he teased. However, as he stared at the lover's heart wrapped around her neck, he knew for a fact that his friend was serious this time around. Yet even then, Cheng Mu's couldn't help but be a little bit confused. Sister Jian, although nice and friendly, seemed to have a lot of things in her mind, a lot of secrets hidden within her pretty smile. To be able to keep rejecting Huo Liancheng, it didn't seem as if she was playing hard to get anymore, but because she really wasn't interested in him. Maybe he should talk to Wu Wenjing to find out more. He resisted the urge to sigh. As the special assistant of a CEO, it seemed that he didn't just have to help Huo Liancheng manage the corporate affairs, but also his love life. Cheng Mu stroked his chin, as if deep in thought. Why didn't she like him? However, as he stared at Huo Liancheng, he grew even more intrigued. They had known each other for years, and even Cheng Mu's had admitted that he understood the man on a certain level. But he couldn't understand why such a detached and aloof man would give away such an expensive necklace to a girl he just met. The progress was far too fast. Although Jianyun was pretty, her beauty was subtle and sweet one that wouldn't be able to topple empires even if she tried. So why was Huo Liancheng so insistent? At the same time, the two people dancing in the center of the ballroom also had a conversation of their own. To be more specific, it was Bai Shui who was doing most of the talking. Brother Liancheng, why is Sister Jian insisting that she isn't your girlfriend? Carefully wording herself, Bai Shui raised her head and gazed into his well-structured face. There was a glaze of infatuation in her eyes, one that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. He remained expressionless, as if he didn't hear her words. Gazing at his indifferent expression, she felt a sense of loss in her heart. Bai Shui looked at the way his large hands were squeezing her wrists, assisting her across the dance floor. She had tried to hold his hand, to get close to him, yet she couldn't. Every time she stepped forward, he backed away. Every time she twirled, he'd pull her right back. Every time she tried to touch his fingertips, he'd retract his hand. It was as if the entire dance was orchestrated to keep his distance. Bai Shui couldn't help but be bitter. What was so wrong with her that he wouldn't even bother looking her way? In terms of her family, although the Bai family couldn't hold a candle next to the Huo family, it was still one of the largest all across of China. In terms of beauty, she was sure that she wasn't lacking with all her admirers lining up on her doorstep. Yet, why wasn't he interested in her? Brother Liancheng, you like Sister Jian, right? The lover's heart, you gave it to her to represent your love for her? Bai Shui originally wanted to ask what he had seen in Jianyun that was worth his liking, but she knew that her directness would scare him off. This was why she had rephrased her question. Yes, he replied plainly. She blinked, not expecting him to reply. She could count all the words that he had said to her for the past 12 years. Huo Liancheng, although direct, didn't like any small talk. In fact, no matter how much she had tried to make him talk to her, he'd always find a way to redirect the attention or stray away from her. Although Bai Shui had gotten her answer, she didn't feel so good about it. Unknowingly, the first dance had already ended. Huo Liancheng had finally released her and retreated into the crowd. As Bai Shui stared at his retreating back, her heart stirred in her chest. She knew for a fact that after tonight, she'd lose him forever. Her hands clenched tightly. Although she had never really captured his attention back then, at least she could dream, right? Yet, now, it seemed that reality was slowly catching up to her. Huo Liancheng originally wanted to go find Jianyun, but just as he had left the dance floor, he was caught up by a few businessmen. It had been 20 minutes till he was allowed to leave. When he looked around, he saw that Jianyun and Cheng Mu's were sitting together at the far end of the room. As he neared them, he even heard them whispering and laughing into each other's ear like a pair of schoolchildren. He frowned. Fourth bro is here. Cheng Muzi raised his head with a smile. Why isn't Bai Sui with you? Huo Liancheng ignored him, and his gaze fell on the woman sitting beside him. Jianyun must have noticed his gaze on her because she slowly raised her head. When she saw the person standing in front of her was none other than President Huo, a sweet and innocent smile bloomed on her lips. Her cheeks were flushed red as if she had bathed in peach blossoms. Her dark eyes were like a pair of obsidians glittering under the dim lights. Sweat beaded across her neck, highlighting the glossiness of her skin. Even he was stunned for a moment. Why don't you have a seat, President Huo? She patted the space right next to her. He couldn't help but sit down. Jianyun passed a glass of wine to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Giggling, she leaned against him. President Huo, she slurred. The wine tastes really good. If you really like me, then you should drink it in one gulp. Come, I'll join you. It was then when he realized that something was off with her. Taking a sniff of the red wine, his eye twitched violently. It was spiked. At the sight of his friend's confused face, Cheng Mu's burst into laughter, clutching his stomach. How many glasses did you give her? Huo Liancheng asked coldly, obviously not amused by his methods. Not much, just 4 or 5 cups. Cheng Muzi grinned. Chapter 39, Foot Pain Hug. Hearing this, Huo Liancheng narrowed his eyes dangerously. If it weren't for the half-drunk woman leaning against his shoulders, he would have lost all his composure and decked the man in front of him. Instead, he reached for the glass in Jianyun's hand and shook his head. You shouldn't drink too much, he warned like a teacher lecturing his student. You're already drunk. Jianyun was happily enjoying her glass of wine. However, just as she was about to take another sip, it was suddenly pulled away from her. Pouting her lips, she wrapped her arms around Liancheng and tugged on his sleeves. You're so annoying, she whined. Her glassy eyes widened innocently as she stared up at him. I'm not drunk yet. I can drink 1,000 glasses, and I still wouldn't be drunk. Her unusually high-pitched voice bounced off his eardrums. As her slender arms wrapped around his chest, he held his breath. The smell of orchids entered his nostrils, and he could feel his entire body warming up against hers. Just for a moment, he felt his entire world stop before her, and had the sudden urge to wrap his arms around her waist and hold her up against him. However, at the sight of Cheng Mu's mischievous face, he scowled. Let's go. It was far too noisy in the ballroom, and with the other guests sticking into their business every now and then, it was far inappropriate to wait for her to sober up here. Putting the wine glass back onto the table, he pulled on her arm and got up. Fourth bro, it seems that I've already done my job. Chen Mu's teased once more as they were heading towards the door. Guo Liancheng paused for a second before striding away. The couch they were sitting on was actually very close to the door, and in a few steps they had finally reached the gardens. The cool breeze blew on her face, planting refreshing kisses on her cheeks. However, Jian Yun didn't seem to care, noticing that the dessert table was long gone, and pulled her hand away from his grip. I'm not leaving, she shamelessly complained. I want to drink more. We can drink once you get home, he insisted patiently. You're lying, Jian Yun accused, shaking her head in disbelief. You wouldn't let me drink? Now, why would I do that? Tonight, he had seen a different side of her, a louder and more boisterous side to be specific. She was far different from the silent and awkward woman he had brought over from his car. At the sight, the corners of his lips twitched. He liked this side of her. If you lie to me, then you're going to jail. The wind in the garden was far too harsh, and she couldn't help but stumble back. Her surroundings had grown even more blurry as they continued to walk down the stony path, but she forced herself to keep going. Yes, if I lie, then I'm heading to jail. Guo Liancheng used this opportunity to take off his large jacket and placed it over her shoulders. She snuggled under the fabrics, and her curvy figure was soon hidden under the large coat. After leading her down a few more steps, she had stopped again. When he turned back, he saw her standing on the pebbled path with her arms wide apart. Hug, she pouted. Her pink dress appeared silvery under the moonlight, and her voice was like dewdrops on a lotus leaf, slowly rolling down his heart. His breathing slowed, and he couldn't help but admire the woman standing right in front of him. There was just something about her that seemed to have unconditionally captured his attention, drawing him even closer like a siren's song. Her glassy eyes and dark red lips popped out from a background of shady trees and carved fountains. She was adorable, like a mischievous nymph that had just pranced out for the wounds. At the sight, his heart had softened, and the indifference from his features had fallen immediately. Seeing that he didn't say another word, Jian Yun used the chance to move closer towards him. Spreading her arms wide apart, she whined, My feet hurt, carry me. Suddenly, Liancheng heard a burst of laughter from the bushes. He raised his head to see Cheng Mu standing by the tree branches, waggling his eyebrows at the pair. Ignoring his friend, he picked up Jian Yun in one arm and carried her towards the gates with ease. Jian Yun wrapped her arms around his neck, staring at his cold and resolute face. Her fingers trailed across his skin, drawing circles around his jaw, then later on his neck. As a few seconds passed, his breathing became even more rapid, and his Adam's apple bobbed up and down his throat. Her thumb grazed over the bump before bringing her eyes back to his. You're blushing, she whispered in his ear, chuckling. One of the Bai family's drivers had driven Liancheng's car from the parking lot and parked it right in front of the gates. Placing her on the passenger seat, she slowly lifted his arms from his neck, murmuring a few unknown words under her breath. His gaze softened at the sight. Good girl. I'll send you home, he coaxed softly. As he closed the car door, he found that his own heart was beating very fast. Although he hadn't taken a sip of alcohol, it seemed that her drunkenness had started to rub off on him. At the garden, Cheng Mu watched the retreating couple with a secretive smile on his face. His fingers grasped his phone, itching to send a message to his friends when he heard a sniffle coming from behind him. When he turned, he was met with a pair of bloodshot eyes. Bai Shui stood under the majestic fountains with her arms crossed over her small frame. She was trembling under the cold night, making for a piteous sight. Bai Shui? He blinked in surprise, stepping towards her. What happened? How is that woman better than me? What does Brother Liancheng see in her that I don't have? She stomped her heel onto the pavements, frustrated. Just as they were dancing a few minutes ago, she couldn't even get him to hold her hand. But when Jian Yun had asked him to hug her, the man let go of his indifference and carried her to their car. It was unfair. Bai Shui had known him for 10 years, and a woman who had just known him for a few days managed to grab him away from her. Cheng Mu raised his eyebrows. Then why don't you like me instead of Huo Liancheng? In terms of money and looks, I could rival fourth brother too. What do you see in him that isn't in me? What do you mean? You're not Brother Liancheng. Bai Shui frowned, confused as to why he suddenly mentioned this. Then why do you think fourth brother would like you? You're not Sister Jian. Rolling his eyes, he walked away. Sometimes a woman suffering from princess syndrome was one who's most difficult to deal with. Besides, he had far better places to be. Since Huo Liancheng had already left, he as his personal assistant had to go see if he needed any other help after this. Bai Shui was stunned for a moment. Before she could say anything else, Cheng Mu had already left. On the other side of the city, Huo Liancheng was already driving her back home. Unlike her flirty and bubbly behavior back at the Bai family villa, Jian Yun had suddenly turned quiet. He thought she had already fallen asleep, but when he turned to look at her, he saw that she was just staring ahead. Her pale face glimmered under various streetlights, making her seem a little gaunt from all the alcohol she had taken. What are you looking at? He tried to follow her gaze, only to see an array of trees. There wasn't anything interesting blocking their path. Shh, I can't speak. Jianyun raised her finger up to her lips, winking at him. Or else it will attract the police. And why would that be? I drank. I could go to jail, you know? She trembled, peering out the window. Her fingers fidgeted as each second had passed. I don't want to go to jail. Huo Liancheng burst into laughter. However, when he looked back down again, he saw that Jianyun was sprawled over the leather seat, struggling to keep her head afloat. He frowned. Are you okay? What's wrong? I'm dizzy, she murmured softly, clutching her head. Rest for a while, okay? I'll wake you up when we've arrived. He held her hand. Jianyun hadn't drunk in the last few years. Having a few glasses of wine tonight, no matter how little they may be, was still an overwhelming experience for her. She leaned back against her seat, as squeezed her eyes shut, avoiding the nauseous lighting around her. It had become very quiet in the car, and Huo Liancheng couldn't help but use this opportunity to glance at her every now and then. He held her hand throughout the entire ride, letting his thumb graze across the lines of her palm. How many years had it been? These hands had merely shown up in his dreams. And now? He smiled. When they had finally arrived at Jianyun's apartment, it was already 10 p.m. Huo Liancheng unfastened his seatbelt and turned around to look at Jianyun. After the long ride, she was already fast asleep. Her refreshing fragrance floated across the car, tempting him to move even closer. He reached out his hand and slowly caressed her rosy cheeks. The warmth spread across his palms. There was a certain tenderness in her features, one that made him hesitate in waking her up. He couldn't help but think of the time he had stood by her bed the night before, staring at how peaceful she looked when she slept. Not being able to help himself, his thumb grazed over her pink lips. It smelled of orchids, soft and fragrant. As soon as he did so, Jianyun immediately raised her eyebrows. Her long eyelashes fluttered up, revealing a pair of misty eyes. With a sniff, she turned around and murmured, Shuhaiyan, don't follow me. I already said that I don't like you. Shuhaiyan? She had mistaken him for another man. Displeased by this, he pinched her chin and turned her face around. They were millimeters apart now, and he couldn't help but stare at her luscious lips. Huo Liancheng leaned over, and the faint scent of orchids lingered in his mouth. It was a sweet taste, especially mixed with the wine she had just drunk. Not being able to help himself, he slowly deepened the kiss. Chapter 40. I don't like men who are too good-looking. Huo Liancheng felt very comfortable in this position. With his arms creeping around her waist, he pulled her up against his chest. The closer they were together, the more reluctant he was in letting her go. His tongue darted across her bottom lip, tasting the remnants of the wine she had drunk. One moment, Jianyun could feel a man leaning close to her side, and the next moment, she couldn't breathe. She groaned in surprise as a foreign object slipped past her lips, exploring every crevice and corner of her mouth. The corners of her lips inched downward as she struggled to push him back. However, from the amount of wine she had, her movements became sluggish and weak, making it even harder for her to even try. As he pressed against her, a sense of dizziness rushed through her, and she squeezed her eyes shut. Seeing that she had stopped responding, Huo Liancheng reluctantly pulled away. When Jianyun finally opened her eyes, she was met with his dark orbs. He stared at her like a man who had just discovered the entire world. His usual blank gaze was filled with so much emotion that she found herself losing sight of what had just happened. She almost brought her hand up to his face, only to snap out of it and pull away. Who am I? Huo Liancheng suddenly asked in the midst of silence. He was leaning in so close to her that she could see the soft lines marring the sides of his eyes and the pink softness of his lips. Her fingers twitched, and she held her breath. Why were they so close to each other? What happened? Who am I? He asked again. Aren't you President Huo? Jianyun blinked, still confused by his line of questioning. Suddenly, her vision had started to blur, and the different colors started to mix all around her. The dim lighting became a pain in the head as she rested back against the leather seat. However, even that wasn't enough to calm her racing heart. Call me Liancheng. He reached out and stroked the side of her face. If possible, his gaze had turned even more passionate. Immediately, the young woman drew back as if she had just been electrocuted. Glancing at him sideways, she poked his nose. But you're not Liancheng, you're President Huo. As the words slipped her lips, she giggled and tilted her head. And you're handsome. Do you like me? His face softened. Yes. 2 faint dimples appeared on each side of her cheeks. Patting his face, Jianyun teased. If you'd give me a raise, I'll like you even more. Immediately, she raised her fingers up in the air, pursing her lips. You're rich, young, handsome, and have a hella good figure. Who wouldn't want you? Even Wu Wenjing said that all the women in Ming's, even the cleaning lady, wants to be a member of your harem. She snorted and waved her hand up in the air, looking unimpressed by it all. Everyone wants to sleep with you. Harem? What was she talking about? Frowning, Huo Liancheng pinched her chin and brought her up to look at him in the eye. And you? Do you want to? Jianyun quickly shook her head. A funny smile slipped into her lips as if she had just heard a joke. Of course not. Appearing disappointed by his answer, he slowly pulled back. Why? I don't like men who are too handsome. She motioned to his face as if that was already enough proof. Her smile had faltered slightly, and she pushed him away. Handsome men are just too good to be true. I've already suffered once, and I'm not stupid enough to make the same mistake again. Suffered once? Catching on to the meaning behind her words, he narrowed his eyes. Jianyun had drunk a lot of wine tonight, so she had acted differently, compared to her more quiet and reserved self. Huo Liancheng glanced at his watch. Although it was already late, he wanted to stay with her a while longer, use this opportunity to find out what she was hiding. Maybe there was something holding her back from liking him. However, no matter how drunk she was, she still felt that she had said too much. Wagging her index finger up in the air, she placed it on her lips as her eyes glittered secretively. I can't say, she whispered. It's too embarrassing. Huo Liancheng was about to ask her a few more questions to see if he could get something out of her, but she shifted her gaze. Her eyes widened at the sight of the familiar buildings all around her before turning to him. We're here. Jianyun gasped excitedly, clasping her hands together. You're so awesome, President Huo. I didn't even see you drive, and we're suddenly here. Ecstatic, she was just about to step out of the car, forgetting that she was still wearing her seatbelt. She had gotten up so quickly, only to find herself plopping back onto her seat, stunned from the sudden force. What just happened? Huo Liancheng was just about to warn her, but it was already too late. Seeing her collapse back onto the seat, he couldn't help but laugh to himself. The girl was far too adorable when she's drunk. Jianyun stared at the seatbelt for a long time, unable to comprehend the contraption strapped to her chest. Her hands played around with the straps, pulling and tugging at them with all her mind, but it was no use. Not wanting her to panic, Huo Liancheng silently unbuckled her seatbelt and assisted her out of the car. However, as they were heading up the steps, Jianyun suddenly stopped moving. I'm dizzy. She stomped her foot onto the pavement like a spoiled child. Carry me. How could he refuse? With an amused sigh, Huo Liancheng carried her bridal style all the way up to her apartment. Luo Yanyan had just finished washing up. Her wet hair was tied up into a ponytail as she picked up her toothbrush from one of the cups. However, as soon as she stuck her toothbrush into her mouth, she heard the door creak open. Knowing that it was Jianyun, she strode out of the bathroom. Yun, didn't you say that you'll be back this afternoon? What happened? Oh. Before Luo Yanyan could finish her sentence, she was left dumbstruck by the sight that had greeted her. In front of her was a man carrying Jianyan in his arms. They made for a sweet sight with their intricate postures. They looked like husband and wife who had just come back from their honeymoon. However, there was something familiar about this man. Upon closer look, Luo Yanyan staggered backward. Wasn't this the same man that she had seen back at the elevator? What the hell was he doing here? And why was he carrying her? Despite feeling a bit faint, she immediately rushed over. What happened to her? Normally, Huo Liancheng wouldn't have responded to such a question, but for some reason, he found himself replying patiently. She drank too much today. When Jianyun heard a voice coming from the other end of the room, she yelped in surprise and turned around, waving her fingers up in the air as if to say hello. A sleepy smile slid into her lips as her glassy eyes glazed over. Yanyan, she cheered, clapping. What are you eating? Is that foam in your mouth? Is it good? Yun, why are you so red? Luo Yanyan scolded. Staring at the oversized coat wrapped around her shoulders, she couldn't help but glance at Liancheng. Mister, do you mind putting her down first? He nodded. Letting go of her hand, he slowly placed her down back onto the hardwood floors. However, just as Luo Yanyan was about to pull her hand and help her back to bed, Jianyun shamelessly held onto the man's neck, refusing to let go. Her dark red lips shaped into a pout as she whined. Carry me. Rubbing her forehead, Luo Yanyan resisted the urge to smile. This was the first time she had seen her friend this forward before. I'm so sorry, she apologized. Yun isn't always like this. Huo Liancheng glanced at her flushed face and droopy eyelids and knew that the rose brew was starting to take effect. While the wine could make anyone drunk within a few glasses, it could also lull the person to sleep. That was why they should drink in moderation. Not only had Cheng Mu's given her a glass too many, but she also wasn't a strong drinker. Luo Yanyan was just about to ask him to send her back to her bedroom when she saw him stride away. She blinked. How did he know which room Jianyun was in? As she was brushing her teeth, a thought occurred to her, and she froze. Did they? Thinking back to the way the handsome man had gazed at Jianyun, Luo Yanyan couldn't help but be suspicious as to what had happened the night she hadn't come back. Wariness bloomed in her chest, and she decided to follow them. After all, from what she had remembered, Jianyun didn't mention any man in her life, and this couldn't have been her blind date. She must check them out to see if her friend was okay. However, when she entered Jianyun's bedroom, Luo Yanyan almost bit into her toothbrush. Her eyes widened so much that she was afraid that her eyeballs would come falling out. She blinked repeatedly, trying to see if her own eyesight was playing tricks with her. But every time she opened her eyes, the scene was still the same. There, in front of her, Jianyun had pressed the man against the mattress and made out for him as if it was their last day on earth. Luo Yanyan gasped, suddenly feeling faint from the entire ordeal.